How to make 100+ horsepower on your 2022 plus Subaru WRX. In this video, I'm gonna give you a complete rundown of what you need to do to your VB WRX to make 100+ horsepower. And this is gonna be actionable, whether you have one that's slightly modified, you're thinking about buying one, you have one and you wanna modify it. This is the playbook on how to make 100 more horsepower, which is pretty damn significant. And not only that, is we're gonna talk about how to make 100+ crank horsepower, 100+ wheel horsepower. We're gonna talk about what the difference is so you learn a little bit. You know, I want all these videos to be something where you take something away and you can learn not just about modifying, but maybe a little bit about the engineering and how things work. We're gonna talk about that. This will be one of the more interesting videos if you've ever considered or want to modify or are modifying your WRX. And it's one of the more exciting videos just about how and why this car is so damn great, because it's a wonderful car. And we're gonna talk about that. But before we get into that, right below me, down here, is a button and it says subscribe. If you haven't already clicked it, please consider clicking that button. It is absolutely free to do. It will make my day. And more than that, I may have just bought something with a blown engine that is a distant fellow cousin to this car, maybe more like a sibling. And I'm gonna be rebuilding it on this channel and doing a full basically show car build. We're doing a lot of crazy stuff to it. And it's gonna be long form content, like hour-plus long videos, because it may or may not need a new engine. And it's the craziest thing I've ever done, probably on this channel and also in my life. But if you press that button, you will start seeing those videos when they come out. And that's happening in the not too near future. All right, so before we get into a full list on the parts you need and what you need to do to make the horsepower, let's talk first about the difference between 100 crank horsepower and 100 wheel horsepower. So crank and wheel horsepower are different. Crank horsepower is what you see on the manufacturer brochure when you go in to buy your car. This makes, like, I think it's 271 crank horsepower. And then what the wheel horsepower is it's the horsepower that your car makes at the touch of your wheels to pavement, which means the power that your car actually delivers on the pavement. So that's like your delivered horsepower. Wheel horsepower is the more important power because that is the power that basically equalizes cars. What does that really mean? All cars have crank horsepower, but the problem is they don't deliver the horsepower the same. A front wheel drive, a rear wheel drive, and an all-wheel drive crank horsepower, if they were all the same, are gonna have different wheel horsepowers because you lose power through the car. What does that really mean? As the power is made at the engine and it goes all the way to the tires, it has to go through a bunch of mechanical devices. It has to go through thermal losses, thinking heat losses, and it has to go through energy transfer losses. So you have all of these losses. There's translational losses, transitional losses. You know, these are all engineering and physics terms, but you're basically losing energy as you get through the car and to the ground. A great example is an all-wheel drive car loses the most, right? It has the most mechanical parts that have to operate, i.e. you actually drive with all four wheels, right? There's more mechanical losses, and therefore, because there's more linkage, you have more energy loss through thermal loss, and essentially you have more loss of power from your crank to your wheels. So specifically because the WRX is an all-wheel drive car, you have the most amount of loss between your crank and wheel horsepower. Specifically around this car, the best estimate, depending on driving conditions and where you are in the country, could be anywhere from 18 to 25% loss. Yeah, 25%, that's just because a large portion of the United States lives in other areas where your thermal losses, your transitional losses are a little bit higher, because the things that define those are things like ambient pressure, ambient temperature, and things like that. But it's pretty significant. So when we talk wheel horsepower, crank horsepower, it's very different. The other thing is that Subaru came out with this car and it's pretty conservative in terms of their numbers. Take an example, the VA WRX. That makes 268 crank horsepower, but when you actually put it on a dyno to figure out the wheel horsepower, it only makes between 205 and 220 wheel horsepower, depending where in the country you are. This car, it makes 271, but because that number is pretty conservative, when you get it on a dyno, it's making about 260 wheel horsepower, which is pretty substantial, which means Subaru has done a pretty good job kind of like underestimating it so it actually delivers. Meaning that off the rip, although it only has 3 more horsepower, it's actually got a pretty good amount more horsepower than the VA WRX because Subaru was very conservative in that number. So now what makes this car so damn beautiful is that to make 100+ crank horsepower, you don't actually have to do that much. Because we have that little bit of room on what it makes from wheel to crank, all you actually have to do to make 100+ crank horsepower on this car is simply buy a Cobb access port, an intake, and we're gonna go very specifically here, and at the very minimum, get an e-tune. Now this could be one of the kind of off-the-shelf e-tunes. There are a couple of tuners nowadays that have They're not traditional off-the-shelf tunes. Like D-Man Tuning has an off-the-shelf e-tune that is specifically for certain types of intakes on this car, depending on where you are in the country, that pushes the boundaries a little bit more than a traditional Cobb OTS tune. Now, just that alone will get you to, and I don't have the OTS tune, I have the intake and a custom e-tune. I'm making about 340 wheel horsepower with this car. So just that alone, when you think about your, let's say 20% loss, right? We're gonna use 20%, and that means we're gonna jump that 20% just to get our crank horsepower, which is gonna put me, you know, right around like 410, 405, 410, maybe 415, depending on the conditions, crank horsepower, which if this makes 271 crank out of the, out of the box, I'm making about 400 crank with the current tune. I've then surpassed my 100 crank horsepower. So that's pretty amazing. For, $600-700 for a Cobb Access port and maybe $400 for an intake, you're making 400 plus crank horsepower in this car, which is very, very easy to do. Now, let's say you want to go one step further and you want to pass that wheel horsepower number, right? So to pass that 100 horsepower, wheel horsepower, you really need to get to like the 360 or 370 wheel horsepower. Now, we're not going to talk about flex fuel or anything like that or any ethanol tuning. We're simply going to make that with a intercooler, specifically a top mount intercooler, because you don't really need to go front mount on this car unless you're making much more horsepower, which you probably need a transmission at that point. And we're going to go one step further just to make that power safely. And we're also going to say either an intermediate pipe or a turbo back exhaust on this car. You can probably push 360 wheel horsepower with just an intercooler, but that's really pushing the car. I traditionally like to have my cars tuned with a little bit more safety in mind because I daily drive these things. So I'm going to go with probably going to go with an intermediate pipe and a top mount intercooler just to make that 360, 370, which it should pretty easily do. We're seeing that pretty commonly. And that's all you have to do. So just to say it, for about $1,000, maybe $1,100 with your own installation, plus the tune. So we're saying like $1,400. Let's say $1,500. Let's make the tune a little bit more expensive. But if you go with D-Man, you're probably looking at like $1,400 with even a custom tune. You're gonna make 400 crank horsepower, 400 plus crank horsepower. Now, if you add the intermediate pipe and the top mount intercooler, you're probably looking at like, let's bump that number up to like $3,500, $3,600 total out of the box. You're gonna make, you're gonna make 100 plus wheel horsepower, which again, think about those numbers a second. That's gonna take you into that like 450, 460 crank horsepower range with a couple grand, like $3 or $4 grand, which is absolutely ridiculous. When you actually think about those numbers and what you're doing, this car goes from, an average, little sporty sedan to competing with $60,000 plus cars pretty easily, especially because it's got all-wheel drive. So you're already at a massive advantage in terms of putting that power down that other cars are spending tons of money on very expensive tires, like yada, 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 and still are going to be struggling if they're in a rear-wheel drive mode. To give you full perspective, right? My car is going to keep up with like a Toyota Supra or, name another $60,000 plus, fast car. My car is going to keep up with it. The downside is those other cars, you then get to tune them and then it gets out of the box. But I'm just saying that this is a pretty damn fast car with this. And I haven't done that much. We're talking about 4 mods could get you to 450, 460 crank horsepower. And when you play the horsepower, who has the bigger horsepower game, people usually play crank. They say crank. And then when you ask, is that wheel or crank? They're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Whenever you're at a car show, that's pretty common. Or you get to the guys that are talking wheel horsepower because they know what they're actually driving or whatever it is. So, that's basically the video. I mean, this is an amazing platform. The engine is absolutely incredible. What you can make in terms of power is just nuts. I can't even emphasize how nuts it is that you can make that kind of power with one, such little money, and two, so few mods. And honestly, guys, all of those mods are things that you can do yourself, right? You can do all of that stuff yourself, and it's pretty cheap. That's why I'm not giving you installation costs, because honestly, if you're going to go that far, I would do it yourself so you start understanding mechanically what's happening with your car. It will save you money long term if you plan on tuning it. And that's kind of one of those things where I could digress and go into this whole tangent about if you're tuning your car, you need to be mechanically inclined. And if you're like, no, I want to tune it and set it and forget it, buy a more expensive car so you don't deal with all the problems that come with tuning cars. Not that there's a lot of problems, but there's more maintenance involved. Yada, yada, yada. I will make a separate video on that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, and hopefully you're looking forward to the thing that I haven't announced on the channel yet, which might be the craziest thing that I've done yet. And don't worry, this car isn't going anywhere. I'll see you guys in the next one.